Well, good morning and welcome to day 3 of Louisiana Wind Week. My name is Harry Vorhoff and I serve as Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. Today we'll be focusing on the existing users in our coastal waters and in the Gulf of Mexico to better understand how, when, and where they use the Gulf of Mexico and our coastal waters. We will also discuss any concerns that they have and opportunities that they see with the prospect of offshore wind development. As you can see, we are right in the middle of Louisiana Wind Week. We had a great first couple of panels yesterday and Monday, and we have 2 more after today. If you missed any, we will be uploading the videos of the recorded sessions by the end of the week on the Wind Week website. But we certainly hope that you can join us through this week and participate in those sessions. We have a fantastic panel today. We will start off with a presentation from Daniel Ingold, Program Manager for Renewable Power and Development and Global Practice Leader for Wind Power with Jacobs Engineering Group. He'll provide an overview of offshore wind power, what these wind farms look like, and provide some context for what they may look like in the Gulf of Mexico. We'll then pause for some Q&A from the audience. We'll then open it up to our panelists for them to share opening thoughts and comments, and then we'll get into the discussion. Our panelists include A.C. Cooper, President of the Louisiana Shrimp Association, Shane Treadaway, Vice President of Operations for West Bank LLC, Lori LeBlanc, Vice President of Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association, Greg Grandy, Deputy Director of the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, and George Detweiler, Marine Transportation Specialist for the U.S. Coast Guard. We will end our today's session with a good chunk of time for comment from the audience and questions for the audience. We would certainly want this to be engaging. To ask questions or make comments, there are a couple ways. You can type your questions into the chat feature or into the Q&A. We'll be checking both of those features if you want to type it in, but you're certainly encouraged to vocalize and verbalize your questions and comments. You can raise your hand, click that raise your hand button located under reactions on the lower part of your screen, and then I'll unmute you at the appropriate time for you to ask your question. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Daniel to pull up his presentation. I think you need to reshare because I kicked you off when I shared my screen, but and then the floor will be yours to present to the group.
All right, is it up, Harry?
It is up. Thank you. Looks great.
All right. So good morning, everybody. This is Dan Ingold, and I've been working on the wind industry for about 40 years, excited about offshore wind coming to the United States finally. But anyhow, I wanted to go over some basics before we talk about the actual understanding of what's going on so we can engage the existing users. So why the Gulf of Mexico is the first thing that we need to talk about. And we want to talk about it because of the resource. So you've probably seen this map before in other presentations, but for the Gulf of Mexico, as you see, we're looking at offshore winds anywhere from about 7 meters per second up to about 8.59 meters per second. So, you know, in the 15 to 25, 30 miles per hour, fairly consistent winds. Of the Gulf of Mexico, you should know that Louisiana basically has about 60% of the wind resource for offshore wind. So it is the predominant state in the Gulf of Mexico for wind resources. So just want to talk about, with this wind resource, what's happening for the state of the art. The state of the art now for wind turbines. We have the GE, which is the one on the left, and that's a 14 megawatt right now. They have announced they're going to 15 megawatts. And as you see the top of that wind turbine generator, it looks different than the other one, and that's because it's a direct drive with permanent magnets. Where the one on the right is a Vestas, and the Vestas are already at 14 megawatts. They're planning on going on larger. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to 20 megawatts by the year 2030. These are large machines that put out a lot of power, but we're already at the 14, 15 megawatt size. Just for reference, so hopefully you all recognize this building. This is, of course, is the state capitol building in Baton Rouge. And that is, to me, a good reference point, because I know that that building is 450 feet tall. Just to give you a sense of what we're looking at now, that building at 450 tall, we're looking at wind turbines at the 15 megawatt range at 850 feet tall, almost twice as tall as the state office building. So these are huge machines out there. How they're actually put into the place, they're either put permanently, stationary unit, and those are the three to the left. So you have monopiles, and you have jacketed systems. But now, in the recent years, you actually have floating systems. So once you go over about 60 meters, let's call it 180 to 200 feet in depth, it becomes unviable to have those permanent structures permanently mounted, and you go to the floating structures. And the floating structures are happening now in Europe. There are several instances that they have been tested out, but I really see in the future that's what we're going to, and especially for the Gulf of Mexico, as we're looking for the best wind resources where we're reducing the influence to other engaged stakeholders. I think the floating is where we're going to be going. For the foundation type, the permanent ones, you actually have specific machines, jack-up barges like this one with large-scale cranes. So they actually go on site. There's quite a bit of percussion with the pounding for the system. It's a permanent system, and like I said, basically you're looking at less than 200 feet depth that you can do this. These type of jack-up barges are pretty similar to anyone in the Gulf of Mexico from the oil and gas industry, so it's a pretty common type of system that's been used. But now we're looking at the floating type, and what's different with the floating type is they can actually be built quayside, dockside, and then towed into position. And they being not only towed, they can actually be repositioned as necessary. Quite honestly, I see this happening more and more, not only in the Northeast United States for the later projects coming into fruition, but also off the West Coast of California and Oregon, but also for the Gulf of Mexico, that I see this type of system going in. And again, it's similar in design and infrastructure to the oil and gas industry, what they've been using for their floating platforms. So I just want to show you, just like a floating platform for the oil and gas industry, you're using the large-scale tugboats to bring them into position. For the layout of the wind farm, basically you've got your wind turbines offshore. It's going to need an offshore substation platform because you're going to be taking your AC power from each of the wind turbines. You're going to be combining them, and then you're going to export them through an export cable to the onshore and then interconnect to the transmission line. And I know that later in the week, there's actually going to be a focus on getting this power to customers. So they're going to be talking a lot more like that. One thing I want everyone to notice that the offshore wind farms, they need a lot of space due to the both logistics of installation as well as the wake effect. So this is a photograph I found in the North Sea, basically showing the grid pattern of the wind turbines. And this was a pretty dramatic photograph showing the wake from one to the other and why they have to be quite a distance apart. So in the European offshore wind farms, what we've been seeing is we're looking at spacing between the turbines 5 to 10 rotor diameters. So when you're getting rotor diameters in the 260 meter diameter, you're talking 2,600 meters between these turbines. Spacing between rows, 7 to 12 rotor diameters. So it's all dependent, again, on how big these turbine rotors are, the size of the blade from one side to the other. So, and that determines the spacing. And typically they're done in grid spacings, and that's to be more economical relative to the interties of the electric cables between the wind turbines, and also for navigation and just logistical standpoint. So typically infield, we call it infield, and that's the area between the wind turbines and the cables between the wind turbines. They're at 22 to 33 kV. Whereas in the export cables, what actually goes to shore, you're typically, this is from European, about 132 to 155 kV systems. So a lot of interconnection between the wind turbines. You go to a substation platform, and then you're actually looking at taking it through one major cable to the shoreline. Just another example, this is the Thonet wind farm layout. Again, just to show you how they're spread out in a grid pattern, and that you're looking for the most economical lay pattern of the cables beneath the sea for laying this out, as well as navigation and logistics for being able to install these. From a total acreage for these, you got to figure on about 0.02 megawatts per acre of offshore wind turbine capacity. So, you know, another way to look at that is for every 50 acres of offshore space, you're looking about 1 megawatt. So if you're talking about a 15 megawatt machine, you're really talking about 700 acres for one of these machines. So that's how much space we're talking between these. The other thing that we're looking at is not only the wind turbines themselves, which are, you know, from the seabed to going up to 850 feet, but you're looking at cable corridors. And we're looking at cable corridors for that electric cable so that we avoid the shipping channels, the dredged areas, fishing grounds, historic dumping grounds. One of the things that we've been finding, especially on the East Coast, off the coast of Virginia, is the dealing with unexploded ordnance, where you've had military presence over the years. So dealing with that when you do your cable lay. We're looking at seabed structures existing, shoals and ledges, strong currents, environmental concerns, cultural importance. And basically we're trying to not go where the burial of the cable is focused on boulder fields or steep slopes. So really want to simplify our cable corridors, but we have a lot of things that we need to avoid. Most of the cable is going to be buried. So, and that is when they do their construction and operations plan, they will be recommending what they will be putting in for their cable depth and how they're going to create that furrow, that ditch before they put the cable. There are multiple ways of doing that. So anyhow, that all will be documented and reviewed of how that's done, because that has impact for surrounding area of how that's buried. There are areas, though, that will be unburied, then covered. And what becomes important here in the Gulf of Mexico, especially off the coast of Louisiana, you have a lot of cables, a lot of pipelines that are buried. And when we cross them, we are not going to be digging because we don't want to interfere with them. And so we need to actually have either a type of plastic covering or a short iron or iron short sections that cover it, that are then laid on a concrete mat typically, and then they are covered either by other concrete mattresses or bag stone aggregate. So they're not laying open at the bottom of the sea, but they are laid and then covered over. But we have a lot of crossings that are going to have to happen if we do offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico off Louisiana. So that becomes important how that's done. Just to go real quick with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, they have a regulatory roadmap. We're at the very beginning stage of the planning and analysis with that, but there's going to be a lot. There's going to be the area identification. We still have to work on that. There's going to be the environmental reviews as part of that, the leasing notices, Once they have the leasing notices and they have auctions for that, the developers are going to have to do a site assessment plan, and that needs to be vetted by everybody and approved before that can be put in place for the site assessment. And then we actually have to put together the construction and operations plan. How are you actually going to install these wind turbines? Where are you going to lay the cabling? What kind of foundation are you going to use? And what sort of impact are you going to have for the existing stakeholders when you do it in that type of design and installation? So like I said, we're at the very beginning stages of that. On the Northeast United States, we are in construction and operation plan territory. A couple have already been approved and moving forward with that. Right now, with this area, the Gulf of Mexico, there is an RFI that has gone out, and they're calling for information and nominations for locations. And that map is actually from the RFI designating what the area is that they're looking at. So, and I will have, for release at the end of this, I'm going to have a credit and reference slide that will give you all the information if you're interested in any of this. So just an example for the environmental impact statements, EISs, the system the site assessment plan, and the construction and operations plan. So that bottom one, the construction and operation plan, that's the South Fork Wind Farm, and that's one that Jacobs Engineering we put together for that. So these have all been, there are several companies out there that do this. For the EIS, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, they take the lead on that and they contract it out. But the developers themselves, they have to put together the site assessment plans and the construction and operation plan. Just to give you an example of where we are with offshore wind projects in the United States. So starting back in 2012 in Delaware, all the way up to recent, that we have, and this is just from 2 weeks ago, the current status is either in site assessment plans or the construction and operation plan. So, and then we're looking for moving forward for building these larger projects. You should be aware there are 2 offshore projects already in existence. One is the Block Island wind farm, which is 5 wind turbines off Block Island, Rhode Island. And the other is off the coast of Virginia. And there are 2 Gamesa wind turbines off there, and Dominion Energy has been working on that one with Siemens Gamesa. So, but this is the number of projects already in fruition. And just so you know, we're talking about 1.7 million acres have already been leased. Just want to let everyone know, we need to talk about stakeholders here. And there are a lot of stakeholders that are already in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's very important for them to not detract from their ability to use the Gulf of Mexico. So I know we have the US military. So everything from Tyndall Air Force Base on the panhandle of Florida, they're flying the F-35s out of that. You have Pensacola, which is for the US Navy. You have Corpus Christi on the other side down in Texas, and they're also doing pilot training. So you have a lot of that, and they're not only for pilot training, but they're going to be interested in radar impacts, surface and subsurface operations. The FAA is going to look at obstruction to air traffic. The Coast Guard is going to be very important here because, you know, in their responsibilities and authorities, navigation and search and rescue. You have the fisheries, which are of key importance to Louisiana. Oil and gas infrastructure, which is already out there and proven over the last 80 years. In the future, we're going to be looking at other offshore wind farms and renewables. We may be looking at hydrogen generation in the near future and how that is going to be impacted by what we're doing for offshore wind. We have the ports and shipping through the entire area, dredging and disposal. We have aggregate extraction that's actually going on right now in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's a very vibrant industry, and we'll talk about that. We have existing subsea cable owners and operators. And of course, you know, that's key importance to Louisiana is recreation, fishing and boating. So we have multiple stakeholders, and this is just a part of the list of what's out there of who should be involved. Just want to show real quick, you know, this is what we're looking for the offshore oil industry and for pipelines already there. What I was saying about, crossing existing pipelines, existing subsea cables, that becomes fairly important here. And not competing or obstructing with existing uses is of key importance here. So just want to show you that the Gulf of Mexico is very active relative to the oil and gas industry. Successfully so. And the other thing, just wanted to show you real quick, the sedimentary provinces offshore Louisiana. So one of the things I just learned recently was about the aggregate and how important ship shoal is relative to the aggregate industry for Louisiana. So it's what we're going to be looking at, and engaging in and making sure, like I said, that we don't conflict and we don't reduce the ability for their other resource use within the Gulf of Mexico. All right, and with that, Harry, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Daniel. That was a fantastic overview and primer, just to give everybody kind of the same baseline understanding of what these wind farms are going to look like or would look like, and kind of how they'd be laid out. So thank you for that. We do have a question for you from one of the audience members. Can oil and gas platforms be repurposed as offshore substations? Could this provide some significant cost and time savings? And so kick it over to you, Dan, and then I'm sure Lori LeBlanc, one of our panelists, might want to hop into that question as well.
Okay, the short answer is yes. If I wanted to get technical with it, I see a strong opportunity here for the reuse of oil and gas platforms. What I really see happening is not only the offshore wind industry, but also the generation of hydrogen using electrolysis offshore and the storage of that. It's a resource that we have. We should be looking at how to make it the most viable reuse of that resource. So I think there's a strong possibility. We're looking at that, of course, in the Gulf of Mexico, and also looking at, we're looking at for the Gulf of California or off the coast of California, doing the same thing for a number of floating oil platforms.
Thank you. Lori, would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, happy to do that. Good morning, everybody. I was going to maybe say some of that in my opening statements, but perfect opportunity to talk about the Gulf of Mexico and the oil and gas industry and the infrastructure that's already there. And absolutely, the offshore industry is interested in consideration of alternative uses of their jackets, those that are ready to be decommissioned. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity. The unique thing about the Gulf of Mexico is that we do have the oil and gas infrastructure, right? And that's a lot different than other offshore areas. It's our understanding that jacket structures would cost tens of millions of dollars to install new if they needed to, for the collection or the technology to test the platforms. But these current end-of-life oil and gas platforms may have significant design life left in them. So if you remove all of the oil and gas production equipment, if you remove all of that, they can be repurposed. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to leverage that infrastructure that's currently there in the Gulf of Mexico. And I appreciate Dan's presentation. It was very insightful. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, that's part of this this panel, is to really kind of identify not only the concerns, but those opportunities. So thanks for that excellent question. We have another pretty technical question from Mary Burgoyne. I apologize if I mispronounced that. If you do short cast iron coverings, how do you do cathodic protection? Is that something in any of your wheelhouse, Daniel, or?
No, but I can get the answer to that. But no, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Cathodic protection is always important whenever you have metals, especially the ferrous metals, and how do you prevent them from degrading over time, so corroding over time. So actually, if you get my email to her, I'd be happy to answer that. But yeah, that's pretty technical. That's a great question, though.
Yeah. Well, Mary, we'll connect you and try and get you some information on that, and share it with the group as well after the fact. We have another question. The Haliade X, is that how you pronounce the, is a class 1 turbine? How
That's
difficult?
the GE, yeah.
That's the GE one. How difficult is modifying Class 1 turbines to operate in the Class 2 and 3 winds in Louisiana? Also, how much of the turbine's generation capacity and efficiency is lost?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So right now, the GE and Vestas, they're talking about a 61% capacity factor in primary winds. But you're right, going up to the different classes, as long as we're looking at 7.5 meters per second and greater, and that's the readings at the 90 meter height. We're going to go much higher than that. I think we're going to find that we are going to go with a larger rotor diameter. We'll probably have the same size tower, but a larger rotor diameter at maybe another 10 or 15 meters longer to be able to get the wind power to the point where we can have capacity factors in the 50 to 60% range. So look for the Gulf of Mexico, because we're at about the 7.5 meters per second, going to larger rotor diameters specifically for the area machines.
Excellent. And do you mind reminding the audience what the class system is for winds and how that?
Yes. So it's basically looking at you're looking at a couple things. One, you're looking at average wind speed, but you're also looking at the gustiness of the speed for the winds. And so the idea is to have machines that are, whether they're, what class they're in, what is their ideal wind environment for? And of course, if you're in the North Sea and you have winds that are an averaging of 10 meters per second, you're going to be doing something different to your rotor diameter than you are in the Gulf of Mexico, where you're going to have an average wind speed at 90 meters at 7.5 meters per second. So it's tuning the machine.
Oh, and those are typically longer blades for the slower wind speed?
That's typically how they do it. Yep.
Gotcha. Excellent questions. Joni Tuck asks if there are opportunities to utilize living shoreline type of concrete structures which recruit oyster and or coral growth to cover transmission lines on the seabed to enhance habitat quality.
Well, a lot of it's going to, so in their construction operations plan, they'll review how they're going to be doing it. Most of it's going to be buried. But you're right, anytime you cross and you do the concrete matting or the bundled aggregate, then you do have an opportunity with that. The other thing that happens, I just want to let you know that there's a study that was just, I've got a copy of it. There's a study that was just done off the coast of Block Island, where they're looking at effects of Block Island Wind Farm on coastal resources, lessons learned. And I can share the documentation with anyone if they're interested. But what they're showing is what the effect on fisheries were. And what they were showing with, these are only 5 wind turbines with a standard jacketed foundation, that they saw a 1,200% increase in sea bass. Sea bass love structures. So they now have founded structures and they've dramatically increased. But at the same time, they found not as dramatic, but a slight decrease in long-fin squid. So pretty interesting report. By putting in not only the wind turbines, but the cabling itself, you are going to be impacting the fisheries.
No, we need to circulate that report. That sounds like an interesting one to kind of learn from past experiences. Pulling from our conversation yesterday about impacts to aquatic and avian species, there's kind of this concern that if you're attracting more aquatic species to the turbines themselves, or that are you also therefore attracting some of the fishing birds species, and that may create a hazardous situation for the birds while you're increasing the kind of habitat and opportunity for increased population of the aquatic species. So I don't know if that's in the report, but just something to, for everyone to consider, sort of the consequences of certain benefits. It might not always be or it might present additional challenges elsewhere.
That's right. We have to be careful of unintended consequences.
Certainly. And then we have a question that has come up often, and hopefully you can speak on this, Daniel, about hurricanes and kind of the hurricane rating or typhoon rating of blades and the structures. I guess, do you have a good sense of kind of where the state of the industry is and with respect to some of the ratings out kind of in Southeast Asia with some of those developments, and then, or just generally kind of where I'm aware that is on everyone's radar in terms of working to develop those.
No, we've had Category 5 in the Gulf of Mexico. I very much remember Katrina, and I did a lot of work in Louisiana in the cleanup for that. But what we have seen in the North Sea relative to the wind speeds and the damaging storms there, we do have a high survival rate. The wind turbine manufacturers like GE and Vestas are very much aware of that, and they have created robust machines that will survive. As you face the high winds, they actually have a cutout speed where they actually feather the blades. They want to show the least amount of profile to the winds, but they have a high survival rate. So from a viability to do projects like this in the Gulf of Mexico, very much a yes.
Excellent. And it's similar kind of with turbine design. We have a question from David Becker. Daniel, where are we with vertical axis wind turbines?
All right, so vertical axis wind turbines. So you have the Darius hoops and you got Savanius rotors, and I actually did my graduate work on vertical axis.
Perfect.
It's interesting in that it is still unfortunately, it's not a leading edge technology like hydrogen. It's more of a bleeding edge. They actually have some mechanics to still figure out. And basically, I can get into real technical stuff about this, but it's bearing survivability. How do you have a survivable bearing with a vertical axis? So, what you typically see, what I showed the photos of, are horizontal axis wind turbines. The vertical axis are basically putting all the pressure down vertically, and then you have a torque aspect of it. Quite honestly, I think it will happen, but I still think it's about 15 to 20 years away before the technology catches up with the need.
Thank you. I'm getting some questions along those lines yesterday and the day before, so appreciate you providing your insights on that. All right. Well, I think the board is clear. And so I think now we'll turn into our roundtable discussion. As Daniel had mentioned, BOEM has their request for information out currently, a request for information and request for interest. The deadline to submit comments is July 26th. This is not a forum so submitting comments here does not qualify. You have to go to the Federal Register website or mail in your comments as they instruct on that website. But they are soliciting not only input from developers, but they're soliciting input from stakeholders to understand, concerns, potential impacts to existing users. So that is, to those who are listening in, not only on this panel, but also as attendees, please, they are interested in learning about your interest and concern, and that will help ensure that they're taken into consideration as this process moves forward. And so the earlier and more often you can present your point of view, the better it is in terms of working through any potential conflicts or concerns. So with that, we have a fantastic group of panelists to just represent a slice of the many stakeholders. And so I just wanted to kind of run down the list and just give everybody an opportunity to provide their a little bit of background about how they use the Gulf or coastal waters, and share any sort of reactions to Daniel's presentation. And so we'll start off with AC Cooper, President of the Louisiana Shrimp Association.
Good morning, y'all. One of the questions is how far out are we planning on going this? The fisheries mostly they drag between 14 miles out in, and placement is one of the big issues. And does the line put off enough voltage to hurt the species around it? Will they feel that, or what kind of? Do you have any information on if that affects anything around the surrounding area when the line passes? So we do go out a good ways, and that's the main concern, because we have a lot of shrimpers that drag off the coast of Louisiana, and putting their lines in here, we want to make sure that they don't get wrapped up in these lines or damage their equipment, or also the equipment that's coming in. So there's quite a few questions that we really need to answer, and which is good. I'm glad to hear everybody put in their 2 cents and really makes a difference. We just need to understand what it's all about, entails, and what's going to be the downfalls of what's going to happen. We don't know. That's why we want to learn as much as we can about it.
Well, I'll start off just that state waters go 3 miles out from the coast, and then federal waters is beyond that. The state does have an offshore wind or a wind leasing program and regulations already in place for state and lands and waters. BOEM's process would certainly be in federal waters more than 3 miles out. Both are currently on the table. The wind resource does tend to get better the further out you go and the higher up you go. Correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, but so I think at this stage we just want to I think commenting on both near shore and offshore and implications for both would be very valuable.
Right, exactly, and that's the main thing. If you get that study that you have, where we see what happens in other places, so we can do a little research for ourselves and kind of understand the whole process is one of the main goals that we want to look at. Want to see what's going to happen to around it, and what's he doesn't answer the question about hurricanes, so that was a big question that we was all talking about. So yeah, anything we can get to understand it better is good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, I'll take this opportunity to kind of ask perhaps Daniel or Lori or anyone else about just perhaps the difference with dragging with concerns with transmission lines versus pipelines. Because as the map that Daniel showed in his presentation, there's certainly a robust network of pipelines existing in the Gulf, and so kind of how is that navigated today? And kind of is there much of a difference, or do you foresee any difference in how to navigate, so to speak, the transmission lines?
Yeah, NOAA's got a good sense, and they put the black boxes on the boat on the outside, so you can see where the most dragging is at, the most usage of the Gulf is going to be at. So that's one thing you have to take a good look at and see where is the most heavily worked areas, and kind of go around some of that. That would be a great deal for us.
AC, this is Dan. So totally agree with you. And in the stakeholder process, I mean, those references and recommendations are going to be of key importance, because especially for shrimpers, with the offshore wind platforms, if you have a floating platform, they're going to have actually your mooring lines. You're going to have your electrical cable going down, and yes, anytime that you cross existing seabed cables, any pipelines, basically you're going to be able to have the concrete mattress. You're going to have the protected undersea electrical cable, and then you're going to have mattresses and aggregate on top of that. So you're going to need to know. It's going to have to be recorded properly, so that it doesn't affect your dragging capabilities in that area. You know what you're getting into.
Effort is a lot to do with it. We can take a good look at NOAA's data on effort in the Gulf, and that would give you a good sense of where most of the effort is at. And one more question, and the lines with the with the vultures going through it, does that interfere with the fisheries or fish or the habitat around it?
Yes, you know, if it's a standard foundation, jacketed foundation or monopile, there you're attracting fish just like they saw off the coast of Rhode Island with the sea bass. So it totally changed the habitat in that area. So you can imagine if you've got a grid pattern of wind turbines over 50,000 acres, that habitat's going to change, and it's going to change what sort of sea life is going to be there. So I don't see so much relative to the cables coming ashore. You know, they have some impact, but not nearly as great as an impact as the actual grid pattern of the wind turbines themselves. There will be an impact, so we need to be aware of that. And like I was saying, we got to be aware of any unintended consequences, both pro and bad.
Well, if you have any literature on it, you know, we appreciate you get it to us so we can go over it and try to take a good look at it and see what's the best interest of the stakeholders in the Gulf. And that's the main thing that we want to do the best we can and try to keep the conflict out of it, you know, because we definitely don't want these guys to go out here and grab a cement mats or whatever, and it's gonna have to be properly marked. It's gonna have to be a designated area where they know that they can't go. So, you know, it has to be clear to them. That way they know they're not going to go tear your stuff up and also their self.
Absolutely agree.
Certainly. And we can do some information sharing. And really, this is the first forum of what I believe are going to be many forums and opportunities to engage. So we'll have more opportunities to kind of review and, you know, what literature is out there, what studies are out there, and then come back and discuss further. So thank you, AC. We'll now move over to Shane Treadaway with West Bank LLC to share some opening thoughts.
Harry, thank you. Hope everyone can hear me. Thanks for letting us participate in this call. We had similar concerns that AC has, but the difference between us and the shrimp organization is that we are not dragging our nets across the area. We more of find a location or a school of fish, and we just encircle them, and then we scoop them up. So, you know, once the set's made, we're at the beck and call of the wind and tide, obviously, but we're not covering a huge amount of territory when we make our set. You know, I had questions along the same line as AC did, you know, the desired water depth, location. You know, one other thing I'd like to add was, are there restrictions when navigating the areas? Do we need to stay a certain amount of distance away from the farms? Can you navigate through the farms? Can you know, there's tons of things that need to be discussed. But you know, I don't see a huge potential or a huge issue when it comes to menhaden fisheries in Louisiana. Other than, you know, and you asked the question yesterday was regarding fish spotters. I think that would be the only issue, and that's something we, you know, if you have this huge farm out there, obviously we're going to stay away from it. You're not going to want to fly a plane at 500 feet altitude when it's 850 feet tall. And again, location is everything. It's everything. We typically operate within 1 mile to shore. We spend a lot of our time. We're considered a near coastal fishery. That's where menhaden typically are gathering in the shallows along the coast and the entire coast. At different times of the year, we may go as far as Morgan City. We spend a lot of our time in Breton and Chandelier Sounds. Probably 60 to 65% of our time is spent in the sounds fishing. And again, near coastal, anywhere from you know, that from shore out 3 miles. But again, the majority of our time is, at least 20% of our time is spent a half a mile from shore. Very little time is spent offshore. Menhaden typically, when we start our season, or outside the 3 mile line. We don't spend a whole heck of a lot of time outside 3 miles, but in the beginning of the year they are, and at the end of our season they are. In the midsummer months, they're gathered along the coast in the shallow waters. As far as the fish spotters, Harry, again, we fly a stacked deck. Our lowest altitude plane is 500 feet, and then we go up in increments of 500 feet up to 2,500 feet. We have 11 spotter planes. They fly, we split them. They fly groups of 5, and we have one that's acts as the chief spotter for our company, and he alternates shifts. But that's how the spotter planes are utilized in our fishing. They just fly near coast. I know you asked how far out they go. They tend to stay above the vessels, assisting them with the sets. I don't know. I don't know what further I can add.
Yeah, no, and you said y'all typically stay within 1 mile of shore, but as far out typically as 5 miles. Did I hear that right?
Well, the planes will, when they're scouting, we do very little fish. Maybe 30% is landed outside 3 miles, and that's according to NOAA Fisheries. But we spend, like I said, 20% of our time is within that half-mile range, and then it goes up the further you go, but very little spent outside of 3 miles. So we're typically fishing. The majority of our fish is landed within 3 miles from shore.
And what is kind of the max distance you would go from shore, just to get put a finer point on sort of the max range that you would go out, your boats and planes would go out? Our nets fish or stop fishing in depths of 35 feet of water. So we're pretty limited. It's the further you go out, obviously, the deeper it's going to get. But we spend the majority of our time fishing in water depths, I would say, I don't know, no deeper than 35. That's helpful. Thank you, Shane. Next, we'll go to Lori LeBlanc with Lamoga. Provide some opening thoughts.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Good on volume. You can hear?
Yes. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this great forum this morning as we explore more opportunities for energy development in the Gulf of Mexico. It's pretty exciting. As Harry said, I'm Vice President of Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association. For the association, I also serve as the director of our offshore committee. So I do a lot of work in the offshore field with our offshore operators. Just for background's sake, I just want to let you all know that Lamoga does represent the oil and gas industry in Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. This includes the upstream operators, onshore and offshore. This includes the pipeline companies, the refineries, as well as the LNG operators. As Dan alluded to, Louisiana does have a long history of producing American energy, and the industry has a long history of operating in the Gulf of Mexico. When you look back, the first offshore well was drilled 70 years ago. And since then, the Gulf has produced 90% of domestic US crude oil from all of the outer continental shelf territories in this country. So the Gulf of Mexico is one of the most important regions for energy resources as well as the infrastructure. Currently, the Gulf of Mexico federal offshore oil production is at about 17% of total US crude oil production, and the Gulf accounts for 5% of total US dry natural gas production. Over 45% of the total US petroleum refining capacity is located along the Gulf Coast, as well as 51% of total US natural gas processing plant capacity. I mention all of this because I think the key here is our existing infrastructure, which is a critical component to the future of energy development in the Gulf of Mexico, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's wind or other forms of renewable energy. I also want to mention that our coastal ports are positioned to serve the offshore industry. They have grown around the increased development of the offshore oil and gas industry, and they're well positioned as well to serve any type of offshore renewable industry. I know they have an interest in doing so. It's also important to recognize that the offshore industry has a significant impact to our local, state, and federal economies, our jobs, and especially the contribution to the local communities in terms of the trickle-down impacts. And so while we absolutely support the renewable energy development in the Gulf of Mexico, I think it's important to note that the continued health of the Gulf of Mexico oil and gas industry is a prerequisite for any future wind development in the GOM. The GOM is extremely well positioned for the exploration of new offshore technologies and energy opportunities. I think it stands apart than any other offshore area in this country, considering what we've already done in the Gulf of Mexico with oil and gas development. So whether we are talking about offshore wind or other forms of renewables, expanding the energy portfolio of the GOM will essentially also depend on a continued robust offshore oil and gas industry. I think it's important to note that the offshore wind projects in the US are expected to heavily leverage the Gulf of Mexico supply chain and the manufacturing facilities that already exist for oil and gas. In other words, when you look at marine construction companies and that activity, it's already part of oil and gas, and it's already part of the wind industry. I know some of our companies down on the Gulf Coast are already contributing to the development of the wind industry on the East Coast. So essentially the expertise, the infrastructure, and the established service and supply chain of the Gulf have already made it a leader in this energy transition. And so the supply chain in the GOM is well established, and it's going to be critical for the build out of the US offshore wind sector. When you consider the fact that there are vessel supply companies, marine construction companies, subsea engineering companies, aviation companies, suppliers, safety consultants, all of these companies are currently part of the fabric of the Gulf of Mexico, and they're excited about getting additional business and being part of that offshore wind sector. So I think the demonstrated and continuous innovation from the offshore oil and gas supply chain will work well into the development of emerging offshore energy resources and projects. I think that eventually a more diverse Gulf of Mexico energy portfolio is going to be on the horizon, and the Gulf of Mexico oil and gas companies are ready to be a key part of that energy future. I think we've learned a lot of lessons about coexisting with other users in the Gulf of Mexico, especially around rigs to reef and the fisheries habitat. It's done an amazing job there. We have some of the best fishing in the world in the Gulf of Mexico. And also around the sand sediment resources that are used for coastal restoration and the collaboration there. And I think there is great opportunity for collaborating and coexisting and continuing to coexist in the Gulf of Mexico. And like I said, I think the technology that's already been developed and continues to be developed, and using the resources and the infrastructure that we have is going to be key. So I appreciate, Dan, your presentation. Didn't know a whole lot about the wind development, so thank you for that. And I know, really appreciate being on this forum and hearing all of the questions and concerns of everybody. And I think it's going to be key that as we proceed down this path, that we continue this collaboration and stakeholder engagement and communication to ensure that the best interest of all the users are in mind. So thank you so much, Harry.
Thank you, Lori. Certainly, yeah, the Gulf Coast is a working coast that tries its best to incorporate as many uses and different uses as possible and all work together. And there's been a lot of cooperation and collaboration on that front. And you teed up nicely our next speaker, Greg Grandy, Deputy Director with the CPRA, when you mentioned sediment mining. So Greg, do you mind offering some introductory remarks?
Absolutely. Good morning, Harry. Sound check. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Very good. Well, thank you for those that nice segue, Lori. Just we'll jump into it. The Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, we were established in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina as an agency that was guided to do two things: restore our coastal areas and make our coastal communities more resilient. In Louisiana, we've lost 1,800 square miles of land between 1932 and 2010. So that's 1,800 square miles of land. So as I mentioned, we were established, but we were also directed to put together a coastal master plan, a vision for the next 50 years on how Louisiana would restore our coast and also make our communities more resilient. If anybody's interested, you can download that plan. It's at coastal.la.gov. In addition to our master plan, as we've implemented projects, a lot of the data from the projects or reports from those projects are online. So we understand that this is, we're looking at the offshore today, but we understand those transmission lines potentially would come onshore. So if anyone's interested in information onshore, as it's coming into state waters or further into the state, that data is available. We have a coastal information management system. So everybody has acronyms for everything. So it's CIMS, C-I-M-S. Again, you can go to coastal.la.gov and you can download that information. If you'd like, you can send me an email or email our agency at coastal@la.gov, and we can assist you to find information you may be looking for, whether it's geologic, geophysical, bathymetric, topographic. We have a lot of data that's out there, and it's all open and it's transparent for everyone to find. So in implementing our master plan, one of the primary restoration techniques that we use in Louisiana are marsh creation, barrier island restoration, or ridge restoration projects. All of those projects entail dredging and placing sediment. And in certain cases, particularly in the barrier island standpoint, we're not just dredging any particular sediment, we're looking for sand resources to put along the beaches of our barrier islands. Our barrier islands are the first line of defense from storms to help protect our communities. So those barrier island restoration projects are not just about ecosystem restoration, they're about making our communities more resilient at the same time. Even though we're in a delta, we are in a sand limited environment, and those sand resources, we've had to go further and further out. And there are some great resources of sand that are on the OCS. Three of those resources, one mentioned earlier today out at Ship Shoal, Tiger and Trinity Shoal, and then also St. Bernard Shoal over towards the Chandelier Islands on the eastern side of the state. Those have been identified by BOEM as significant sand resource areas, and they've sent out notice to leasees in those areas about those mineral resources and the importance of those resources in helping Louisiana restore our coastal areas. I will note currently we have a non-competitive negotiated agreement. Some people refer to those as sand leases to dredge sediment from Ship Shoal. We're working on a project, specific project called the Terrebonne Basin Barrier Island Projects. We're dredging today. I believe they're hopper dredges that are mining sand from the offshore, from the OCS. Those hoppers move into shore. They're placing material, I believe, on Trinity Island. They'll move next to Timbalier Island and then over to the West Bell Headlands that's just west of Fouchon that Lori talked about a little bit earlier. So that lease for that particular project, it's about a 10 million cubic yard lease. They'll go in, they'll mine that material, and when we dredge or mine a material, we use what's called borrow area management. So BAM is the acronym for that. So we'll try to mine as much of that material in those borrow areas as possible, so that we can then go move on to the next borrow area. We won't leave little bits of sand behind. We want to mine as much of that usable material as possible as we move on to the next place. One of the activities that we do in implementing our projects, we try to identify the sand resources that are out there so that we can best manage those. So if we're working on one project, we want to use the material that's best from a regional standpoint, so that we're not we're making efficient uses of the resource. So we do investigations, and again, that data and those reports are available on our website. We partner with BOEM and audit the information that we collect for projects on the OCS, is available through BOEM's database as well. One of the things I'll note, and this is a follow-up, I think, to a comment that Lori made also, is we really appreciate our partnership with BOEM and the information transfers that we've been able to accomplish through various stakeholders, through the sand management working group meetings and the information transfer meetings that BOEM has provided. Those are typically held annually. Sometimes usually they're in person. The last year, I believe it was virtual meetings, but we appreciate that opportunity for us to be able to provide our plans and to let folks know where we anticipate working in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, or let them know the details of what we're working on today to help foster understanding among stakeholders. And Lori used the word coexistence, and that's a marvelous word. There are a lot of active stakeholders in not only our federal waters, but also our state waters as well. Oil and gas, navigation, fisheries, as well as just a lot of recreational fishermen. Number one, safety is an important issue to us in everything we do. And we understand wherever those lines are, once those transmission lines are out there, once those first once the first windmills go up, we'll map those areas, and then we'll place buffers on those areas so that we can work safely in and around those areas. So with that said, Harry, I'll be glad to take any questions anyone may have.
Thank you, Greg. That was great. And I think not everybody might have known about CPRI's interest in the sediment mining and sand mining. So I think that is very helpful for those not familiar with the Gulf of Mexico and existing users. And got to hand it to our panelists for teeing up the next one. Thank you, Greg, for teeing up George Detweiler with the U.S. Coast Guard. George, I know we were having some audio issues. Are you able to, I'm going to click that unmute button.
There we go. You should be able to hear me now.
Crystal clear. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me to this panel, and hopefully share a little bit of who the Coast Guard is and what we do and how we're involved in wind farms, because that's what we'll do in the Gulf of Mexico as well. Our mission, to remind everyone, is to ensure our nation's maritime safety, security, and stewardship. That comes down to, again, keeping people safe. We're recognized as subject matter expert for maritime safety, security, and mobility. Our own role in the national defense of this country, we have specific roles in that, and the protection of the marine environment. Since the inception of the Cape Wind Project in Nantucket Sound, the Coast Guard has been a member of every one of BOEM's renewable energy task forces. So we obviously are a member of the Gulf of Mexico Task Force. In fact, I sat in the first meeting as well. We collaborate on the use of navigation safety risk assessments for evaluating specific projects. And we're also a cooperating agency for NEPA purposes. In a nutshell, we want to protect all mariners' property, which includes wind farms and the environment. We will provide recommendations and identify potential impacts as a cooperating agency to ensure safety navigation for the entire maritime community. That's wreck boaters, commercial boaters, whatever. The traditional uses of the waterway, the marine transportation system, and fishing. And we still need to ensure that we can carry out our other missions as well. As mentioned earlier, search and rescue. Basically, in a nutshell, and somebody already used the word, and I'll use it, we've used it as well, we call it mutual coexistence. Basically, used to extend practical, reconcile the need for safe access with the needs of other reasonable uses of an area. But most especially, we need to maintain the safe, secure, efficient, resilient marine transportation system. We get United States imports and exports an awful lot from all the ports around the country, and we can't block them. We have to, if we think a farm is going in a particular place, we're going to have to that's not a good place, obviously we will consult with BOEM. We're in consultation with BOEM. And I'm not sure that I have anything else other than if anybody has any questions. We have been involved in every wind farm. We're reviewing the COPs now for about 13 or 14 wind farms on the East Coast. And we follow all the auctions. We, again, attend the state task force meetings and lend our expertise. And eventually, as the process goes down, we identify possible mitigations that the developer may have to do to keep everything safe. That's the simplest way I can put it. And with that, I'm available to answer any questions. There were a couple comments that were made by other people that I wanted to comment on, but I didn't think it was the right time. So when we get into the Q&A, maybe I'll jump in on that.
Sure, that'd be great. I do have a follow-up because I think one of the questions or comments, I believe it might have been AC asking about how close you can get to wind turbines in other jurisdictions. And in your experience and in conversations you've been a part of on the East Coast and with other developments, is there a standard for how close a vessel can get to a turbine?
The answer to that is no, there isn't. We are not, the Coast Guard is on record that we are not, unless a vessel would be unsafe, safety can't be maintained. We are not limiting or restricting anyone from going into a wind farm for whatever reason. We believe, captains of ships and masters of ships, and hopefully, wreck boater operators, they're professionals, and they should judge their situation accordingly. That said, if all of a sudden the wind farm is constructed and we get a plethora of accidents, and once we find the root cause of the accidents, if we need to restrict people at that point, then we obviously have mechanisms that we can do that. But no, we don't intend. So I think that answers part of Mr. Treadaway's questions about can I go in a wind farm? Sure. We ask that you not run into the towers, of course, and you don't do activities that'll, mess up the cabling. We've had experience where some of the farms actually lay out their arrays, in effect parallel to each other, so you could go down a track between towers and not have to worry about encountering cables because they're running basically parallel with you. Also for safety, we will require marking and lighting plans need to be done so that the towers are identifiable. And so that the mariner, heaven forbid they get lost, if they know what tower they're next to, our operations centers should know exactly where they are, or get a real good sense of where they are within the wind farm. So, yeah, we're not going to preclude. If a mariner thinks they're safe to go in there and go in and get out and want to grab some fish on the way, have at it.
Thank you, George. And yeah, there's got some good questions are piling up. So, but before that, I'm going to try and do something, just pulling up a wind resource map and have some follow-up questions for AC and Shane and Greg. Just looking at this map, can y'all see this map of the wind resources in clear? You can see, so this is from last year's National Renewable Energy Laboratory report on Gulf of Mexico renewable energy potential, and that was commissioned by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Yesterday, in our discussion about aquatic species, a NOAA representative identified that a significant amount of the shrimp landings are, or shrimp resource is kind of on that Louisiana-Texas border. And that is one of the better wind resources aside from that South Texas. And so I wanted to see, kind of looking at this map, how much does the wind resource overlap with your existing use? And let's start with AC. Do you mind sharing kind of where the overlay is for shrimping?
Noah's got the good data on that. We have to go back and look at it, but a lot of us off the Louisiana coast going towards Vermilion Bay and the Texas border, and also in Texas, a lot of people go to Texas also. But yeah, it's a heavily dragged area between anywhere along the coast, but with the fisheries and the shrimpers anyway. So, but towards the west over there's probably a little bit less, more towards the central and eastern part of the state, a lot of it. But we do a good bit on the western side also.
Okay. And kind of Louisiana has a lot of that kind of 7.75 or to 8 miles per second wind speed, kind of across a lot of the coast. But thank you for sharing. Shane, kind of same question. Do y'all kind of go, I mean, you mentioned how far out y'all typically go, but in terms of kind of geography, are y'all fishing kind of across the coast?
So for West Bank, from West Bank's point of view, what is that? Let's say federal state water boundary. Okay.
So that's really, quite close. Okay. So this is a pretty zoomed out view.
Yeah. So the area, where it says Venice on the map, if you just use the north, south, east, west, it reference north of where Venice is, the area that's inside the state federal water boundary. I guess that line's following the Chandelier Islands. That's the Breton and Chandelier Sound area, and we fish that heavily. I would say 60 to 65% of our time is spent in that area. On the western side of the Mississippi River, anywhere from Southwest Pass of the river as far west as Morgan City, and it's not that we're covering that in territory or the entire territory the entire season. It's at different points. Every Sunday our planes go out and they scout, and they report back to the skippers the areas of the most concentrated fish. And so the captain will make a decision, and this fleet is not always together. You may have 1 or 2 boats in Morgan City, 1 or 2 in the Cat Island, Timberlake area, 1 or 2 in West Bay around Southwest Pass, and then the rest of the fleet in Breton Chandelier Sound. We also have another menhaden company in the Gulf of Mexico, and they fish heavily that area from Morgan City all the way to, I would say, Freshwater Bayou, which is kind of a little south and west of Abbeville. And they also fish some in Texas state waters, not much, but anywhere from Morgan City west, they cover that territory.
Okay, gotcha. So I think we'll need some more refined maps as we get in, as we kind of zoom in and look at specific developments and siting. But I do think that this is helpful. In the panel yesterday, the statistics that were offered by that NOAA representative that that in the Gulf of Mexico, shrimp is the top value. I'm not sure which year, I believe maybe 2018, in terms of at $420 million in value in a year, and then menhaden is the top volume for the Gulf of Mexico. So just 2 incredibly important resources with very engaged stakeholders. So happy to have y'all at the table. And I do want to follow up with Greg. Ship Shoal is kind of southeast of Port Fourchon, is that?
Southwest of Port Fourchon is probably just below where about where the O is in Port Fourchon, about 5 to 6 miles offshore. So it's just in the offshore area. Gotcha. I'll note on that map kind of one of the areas that's in over on the state border. The Sabine Banks is another sediment resource area. We have done some mining off of Cameron Parish in the OCS for a project at Holly Beach, and then another project we call the Cameron Parish Shoreline. So both of those we did lease areas offshore. That area along the Sabine has some again some nice sediment resources in those areas, There's a lot of activity, both from a navigation standpoint, but also a lot of oil and gas activity on both the Texas and Louisiana side, in and near the Sabine Banks area. So those would be that on this area, kind of offshore in Louisiana, that would probably be the color that's the highest, as identified on that map from a wind speed standpoint. It's also an area in the nearshore area, let's say 5 miles in. So in the Louisiana state side, our border is 3 miles. On the Texas side, I believe it's 10 miles. So on the Texas side, the Sabine Banks would probably be in Texas state waters.
Mm-hmm.
On the Louisiana side, the Sabine Banks are in federal waters. So just kind of a note over in that area, there's some sediment resources that we've identified for the future that would be of particular interest to us.
Gotcha. Thanks, Greg. To follow up on that, because given the life of these wind farms, which I believe are in the decades, looking ahead at the coastal, for the coastal program, at this point in time, is there an anticipation of needing to branch out to additional sediment mining areas, or is it sort of the replenishing nature of these shoals and areas that typically don't need to expand to new areas?
Yeah, well, we likely will need to expand to some new areas, and not just for sand resources, but also for mixed sediment. So I had mentioned the sand resources for barrier islands, but potentially sort of a mixed resource area as well for marsh creation. That again, as we look at borrow areas and resources that are available for restoration, we'll continue to look offshore. We have about 10 or 11 projects going on right now, currently dredging projects across the coast. One of those projects, and I had mentioned earlier, is using sediment from offshore. The other 10 are either from the Mississippi River or from inland bays or lakes that we're dredging from. But we'll continue to look offshore for those sediment resources over time as well.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that, Greg. And I will offer it to Lori. Looking at the map that Daniel shared earlier, there's a lot of oil and gas operation kind of throughout. I don't know if there are kind of areas that are more active than others, or kind of the prospect is more in the future, looks more active than other parts of the Gulf, or particularly the northern Gulf.
Yeah, Harry, thank you. I would just say that relative to the offshore oil and gas activity in the Gulf of Mexico right now, the trend that we're seeing is more aligned with deep water activity. Has been an increase in deep water activity in the Gulf. So not as much in the shallow water, but there is still activity in the shallow water. But I think that goes back to what I mentioned earlier around opportunities of using maybe some of those platforms that are ready for decommissioning, which multi-use, using them for another function. And I think it'd be a great opportunity to do that. And thinking ahead to, if the state can enable the ability to terminate remaining, like the jacket liability post decommissioning in conjunction with DESI. And I think that would really enable using those for renewables, in that area less than 1,000 feet. So something for us to consider at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
How we make that happen. But most of, like I said, activity is further into the deep water parts of the Gulf of Mexico, activity. But of course, we still have pipelines all across the Gulf of Mexico. And then I was also going to mention, as I have the microphone right now,
Please.
Just as we look ahead, the process, lessons learned, and the robust process that we have used for the offshore oil and gas development, which has multiple layers of stakeholder input throughout the entire process, BOEM with their 5-year plans, and then their EISs and things like that. It really gives an opportunity for everybody, all the interests to be heard, and conflicts can be avoided. I know we were talking earlier about unintended consequences. So it's really a great way to have unintended consequences. And also, I think Dan alluded to the stipulations that are in place for the military. So that military operations along the coast can proceed without being hindered in any kind of way. So a lot of stakeholders and a lot of infrastructure currently out there, and we're going to have to make sure that there's no unintended consequences with this development going forward.
Definitely. Thank you for that. I think it really has been fantastic working with the Gulf of Mexico Regional Office of BOEM and their vast experience with oil and gas leasing and engaging stakeholders through that process. I think we really have, or they have a leg up in terms of starting with a new technology in wind turbines and wind energy. And so really excited about the opportunity for them to leverage that, and kind of they already have contact lists. They already have worked with existing stakeholders. So I think that'll prove very valuable at kind of identifying issues early and working through them. And then I do have a follow-up question. Perhaps this is for George or Daniel. George, you mentioned I think both of you mentioned the grid layout of turbines within a lease, and is that and how that facilitates safety for navigation. Is that really the only kind of layout in town? I mean, are there any other layouts that have been used elsewhere? I mean, it seems to be the most organized and kind of most intuitive, and just wanted to see if they're kind of confirm more than anything, but if maybe there's another layout that you've seen.
So this is Dan. So I'll let George answer that too. But also, I just know that there have been instances, especially in places like around New York City, the Long Island Sound, where they've been doing wind turbines. Access to navigation channels becomes critically important here. So being able to lay out your wind turbines so that they can allow standard navigation to happen safely, that will determine sometimes what the layout is. The grid layout typically is just, it's an easier way for the developer to look at wake effects of one to the other. So they're looking at prevailing winds, they're looking at what they have for leasing area and how do they optimize that. But other elements relative to, boulder fields for putting cabling, or actual access and logistics for the size of the ships you're going to be using for installation, that all is going to have an impact. So no, it doesn't have to be a grid. There's no federal rule that it says it has to be a grid, but it's the most viable, not only for logistics, but for navigation and other uses.
Thanks, Daniel. George, anything you care to add on top of that?
Yes, I assume my phone's on. You can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Yes. With this modified version we're working on. Yeah, there is no absolute rule. We are aware that over in Europe, and we've done an awful lot of discussing with our cousins across the pond there from the UK, and some of the lessons they've learned. They were allowing in the beginning what I'll call haphazard, or what the developer would say is the optimal layout, but with no rhyme nor reason. And I think they learned the lessons. And so the term we use, or the term we have shared with BOEM, and BOEM seems to agree with us, is that we'd like to see a farm laid out on at least 2 lines of orientation. So think east, west, north, south. It could be, slightly canted from that, but basically 2 lines of orientation and in a grid pattern. But we do not specify the spacing. We don't, there has been discussions with us about doing that, and we won't do that because we know the developers look at what wind is available. And so we have farms on the East Coast right now that the construction and operations plans have been anywhere from like a 0.6 to on one axis to a 1 mile on the other axis, grid spacing, we've been at like 0.9 by 0.9, 1.1 to 0.8. Again, we let the developers, because they're the ones that are going to study the winds, they're going to want to do their layout. I know BOEM allows what they call a project design envelope, so they're allowed to, while they have a lease and they're allowed and working on the development, they can kind of, nothing's cast in concrete until very late in the process where they're actually going to put the towers. We definitely, I definitely agree with Dan. Is that, yeah, from the safety navigation viewpoint, the grid pattern works, and it was an issue that we dealt with in the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area. We studied that area, and part of the study was to ensure that we need any other kind of routing measures. Hopefully the farms get located. I mean, there's no empty area of the ocean that doesn't have a ship go through every once in a while. So, but we try to look at the main traffic, and we try to advise BOEM that, hey, these particular areas have minimal traffic, or the traffic is small enough it can still go through, especially hopefully fishing boats can transit. So yeah, that's, I'd say that we're probably gonna stick to that. That'll be our continued guidance to BOEM. Again, 2 lines of orientation and a grid pattern.
Thanks,
So
George.
Not too many specifics.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. All right. Well, I'm going to open it up to questions from our audience. The first one from Matthew Holland. Do state and federal leasing requirements apply only to the wind farm locations, or do they apply to transmission line locations as well? So none of us on this panel speak for BOEM or for Department of Natural Resources, but it is my understanding that yes, BOEM is allowed to let leases for rights of way or rights of way for transmission lines in federal waters. In state waters, that duty is typically, or jurisdiction is typically under the Office of State Lands. I'll say that there are multiple jurisdictions, not only in the utility regulation space and transmission planning space, but also with the Department of Natural Resources, Office of Coastal Management oversees the State and Local Coastal Zone Management Act, and so is responsible for evaluating coastal use permit applications. And as I mentioned earlier, Department of Natural Resources, Office of Mineral Resources has the jurisdiction over the wind lease process on state lands and waters. Next question from Margie Vicnair-Prey. Rhode Island has nothing offshore before the wind farm was installed. We have rigs, platforms, pipelines, etc. for decades. Is comparing these habitats intelligent? I guess, the crux is, are we comparing apples to apples, or even if we're comparing apples to oranges, is there much to glean from that comparison? Offer that,
Hey, this
maybe
is Dan.
Daniel.
So I saw that question. It's a really good question. So from the Rhode Island one thing, just, in comparison, what I really liked what they did with Block Island is they did a baseline first before they put in the wind turbine foundations. And from that baseline, then they actually mandated from the developer to go in on a regular basis to see what the fishery impact was for the habitat there. So this was the first report. It's a data point. I'm not trying to say that we should compare what happened to Block Island to the Gulf of Mexico. That's not the intention, but that process, setting up a baseline before you install the wind turbines offshore, and then being able to follow out with the habitat, I think that's critically important. I'm really glad BOEM had that, ability to do that and demand that of the developer. And I highly recommend the same thing for the Gulf of Mexico.
Thanks, Daniel. The next question we have and please, if there are any other panelists that want to jump in, don't let me cut you off, but move to West Plaisance, asks very similar question on sea life. or to the question on sea life, but how about the enormous number of birds that exist and migrate through this area? Fantastic question. It sounds like you may have missed yesterday's panel, but we'll throw it. We recorded that and we'll throw it up on the Wind Week website. But to summarize, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Randy Wilson. There are a ton of birds out there, and their timing of migration and location, and it's not just migration; it's also the resident birds that go out to sea to fish, and then transient birds as well. It depends based on the species, and it's certainly something that will be thoroughly evaluated and looked at in terms of avoiding it and minimizing or mitigating impacts. A question for George: are wind farms allowed in current Anchorage areas? Or if not, is there any consideration to relocate Anchorage areas?
The answer to the first part is no. We will not permit construction of wind farms within an Anchorage area. That would defeat the purpose of the Anchorage. Conversely, it's a chart feature, and when we look at the placement of the wind farm, if that argument were to come to us, I think we would study it and decide, should the Anchorage, or is there a possibility that the Anchorage could be relocated? We could look at that. We haven't had any of that yet. In fact, if anything, on the East Coast, we're creating a couple anchorages that have either been traditionally used unofficially, and then making it more formal so that everybody knows where it is, as well as we need to identify any anchorage areas because of the cabling. Again, we don't necessarily want to have an anchorage over cabling unless the developer is willing to bury it much deeper according to the Army Corps standards to do that. But we wouldn't indiscriminately cancel an anchorage. No, I think if anything, the anchorage is already there. It kind of exists, and farm, you got to find another place around it.
Thanks, George. Looks like there's a follow-up question for you on a different topic from Michael Wilkes. U.S. Coast Guard undertook a port access route study for the waters off Massachusetts and Rhode Island to resolve a lack of uniformity or consensus among wind farm developers in array layout. Is it preparing to do the same in the Gulf in undertaking a port access route study?
Okay, for a slight clarification, thanks for the question. When we do port access route studies, that's exactly what we're looking at, is the access to the ports. Are there certain routing measures that should be created, especially either fairways or traffic separation schemes? We wanted to make sure that, were there any other routes that were going to be needed around the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area, which is a very, very, very large combined area with like 7 or 8 leases within the same area. Actually, the developers came to us eventually with a proposal that grid pattern, everybody will match everybody else. So their neighboring farms would do the exact same thing. We're going to light and mark the actual farm as if it's one big farm, all 7 or 8 farms. So the second half, don't know the answer whether we'll do a port access route study or not. I think a lot of it's going to depend on potential location of the wind farms. The one advantage that we do have in at least parts of the Gulf, there already are fairways created a long time ago by the Army Corps, even before and then they transferred the ownership of those to us. And but they're there, and they're designed to hopefully protect mariners to know that there's no construction. There's absolutely no structures in those fairways, albeit there are some very close. We won't deny that, but they're not in. They're not supposed to be in. We're looking to create fairways on the East Coast. We may add to that fairway system in the Gulf to give the mariner protection, as well as to, all of a sudden a farm goes in and a mariner goes, well, I used to turn here and go into that port. Now I can't do that anymore. So Again, we may have to look at those kind of routing measures, and that would prompt us to do some level of port access route study.
Thanks, George. Margie McNair-Prey asks, how will monitoring wind farms be different from what is currently done in the Gulf with oil and gas structures? I'm not sure kind of exactly who might be able to answer this, or if we need a little more specificity on kind of what type of monitoring we're talking about, whether it's the structure itself or monitoring for impacts to species, but I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in, or perhaps Margie, you can raise your hand and elaborate, or, yep, I see your hand raised right here, so we will.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of monitoring for any issues. Well, in both ways, with traffic, boat traffic and fishing, as well as habitat issues that might arise.
Okay, so if I heard you out, you cut out a little bit for me, both the impact to habitat and species, but also monitoring of vessel traffic and activity.
Right.
Okay. I don't know if Daniel or George, you have some thoughts, or Lori, if there's any kind of ongoing monitoring in that respect with oil and gas that may be able to shed some light.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't know the answer relative to wind, but I mean, obviously there's a lot of monitoring that goes on in the offshore oil and gas industry. Bessie has inspectors, and Bessie goes out and does inspections on a regular basis. I would imagine that Coast Guard monitors the navigation and marine activity. So not exactly sure the answer for wind, but I don't know if Bessie would be the ones over wind or how that's going to play out. That's a good question.
Yeah, very good question.
No, and from my standpoint, we're still early enough in the offshore wind, generating of infrastructure out there that it is a good question. And for the construction and operation plan, that's going to be a key element. So we'll have to have stakeholder engagement, asking what, and determining what is important. And that needs to be put in both in the environmental impact statement, but also how they move forward both with the site assessment plan and the construction and operation plan. So it's to be determined. That's why we need these stakeholder engagements and stakeholders to get involved. So we need groups, any of the conservation groups, the Sierra clubs, any of the Protect the Bay groups, they need to be centrally involved in this. They have a say and they need to be there.
Definitely, and I'm sure as we progress in this process, looking at other jurisdictions like in the North Sea where they have a little bit of a head start and see kind of what's working and what's not over there. But thank you for your question.
This is George.
And one thing, just following on that, Harry, so, yeah. and Lori, the idea with the oil and gas, just want everyone to know that a company, Equinor, actually is putting up an 88 megawatt floating wind farm. It's going to be the largest wind farm at that point. But what they're doing is not looking for cabling that to shore for electric use there, but they're using it actually for offshore oil activities, for powering them up. So we are engaging in not the competition, but the cooperation between offshore oil platforms and offshore wind. So want to keep following that, but to me, that's a very exciting endeavor that we're having.
Definitely, that's very exciting, and demonstrates that there's it's not cookie cutter. There's no one way of doing it, and I've read that there's interest in some developments that would do green hydrolysis or electrolysis to create green hydrogen and not connect to shore, but and kind of avoid some of that interconnection issues. And Lori, I didn't know if you had something to follow up on.
No, sorry, Harry.
Okay,
Hey, that's very, very interesting, Dan. Thanks for sharing that relative to what Equinor is doing. I think there's so many tremendous opportunities to continue doing things like that. So thanks for sharing.
Definitely. And then George, did you have a comment?
Back to the monitoring, I'm not familiar with it, what the Coast Guard may or may not do for monitoring of oil rigs. We're not necessarily going to monitor wind farms. That said, the developers of wind farms will have their own operations center. And the ones we've seen so far, it's a 24/7 operations center because they want to know what their towers are doing. They want to know, which towers are working and not working, which ones. So, and a lot of them are putting cameras on their towers, which can help, obviously, the Coast Guard. So we have a search and rescue case or things like that. So, and they have vessel traffic constantly going back and forth. I mean, they're going to be running crews back and forth to do maintenance, well, starting with construction and then do maintenance, especially major maintenance, replace a turbine or whatever. And I think a lot of that will be looked at with Bessie. I know Bessie's working with another element within the Coast Guard concerning, environmental plans, like oil spill responses and, whether a ship goes in there and it's created that way, or obviously there's some limited amounts of oil in the turbines, but nonetheless there is oil in turbines. So if that happens, and other response plans. So will there be monitoring by a government agency? I'm not sure. But again, I know the developers have been more than amenable. In fact, some of them have offered to actually run cabling right into our operation centers, and as long as we buy the monitor, they're willing to let us have that and see it. I'm not so sure we want to accept that, but nonetheless, it's under discussion.
Thanks, George. Moving to our next question from Laura McCollum. We kind of touched on this a little bit about hazards, and she asked, for the floating wind turbines with the stabilizing cables, can that 700-acre region be used by other industries, or is it more hazardous? It sounds like underground is problematic with all of the cables, and the wake turbulence is hazardous for aircrafts. And George, I know you mentioned that U.S. Coast Guard doesn't put any restrictions on access, but I guess, in your experience, have you heard concerns like the ones raised by Laura or Daniel? Perhaps you may also be able to touch on kind of concerns that you've heard in other jurisdictions or like on the East Coast to that speak to Laura's question.
Yeah, the part with us right now is, and why we have a 5-turbine wind farm off of Block Island, that's all we have is a 5-turbine wind farm. So we ourselves don't have the ability to analyze or lessons learned. What we're hearing, and we kind of track a little bit informally about over in the UK, they've had very few incidents of larger vessels going past them on the outside having any problems. They don't restrict either within. They may create a 50-meter safety zone around the towers. We are not anticipating that. So that answers an earlier question: is if you're in your wreck boat and you want to go as close to the tower as you want to catch fish, don't run into the tower. You're fine. We don't have a problem with that. But no, we don't really have a lot of lessons learned. I can imagine with anchor fields, what I call an anchor field or tethering field, whatever, to floating, that I could see in and of itself restricting fishing because you got a lot more spread out apparatus, and I have that experience through deep water ports. We've created around a couple of deep water ports that we have around the United States is areas to be avoided and no anchoring areas because of their particular anchor fields. I realize the fields may be different, somewhat different, but nonetheless the concept's there. And I'm not so sure what other areas can be used for whatever's needed. Possibly some form of agriculture could probably be used inside a wind farm because I know agriculture tends to have, be relatively small and usually has, the ones I've seen are, lines running from the bottom to the top, so to speak, to the water. And then critters grow on those lines. So maybe they can go in between the towers. I don't know. Something to look into.
Thanks, George. And I don't know if Daniel or Lori kind of to offer experience with, I mean, there are floating rigs in the Gulf of Mexico today. And so just thinking through some of those, you know, how to navigate those concerns about avoiding impacts, you know, by other users. Either one,
I
Daniel,
do
if you
want
want
to
to hop
say,
in,
so
and then Lori.
yeah, so I referenced the distance between the wind turbines, thinking about 700 acres. But even with the mooring lines, the tethering lines that you have, basically for a 15 megawatt wind turbine, if it's a floating wind turbine right now, you're basically dealing with about 50 acres that you're impacting, that you want to be careful with those mooring lines just for the distances and whatnot. You're not impacting the entire 700 acres. So yeah, just like George is saying, you know, anything floating, and Lori can address this with floating oil platforms, you know, you have to look at what those distances are, but we're talking more than 50 acres, not 700 acres. But it's the distance from the wind wake that we're really concerned about, as well as access to navigation.
Thanks for clarifying. Lori?
Hey, just I mean, relative to the floating platforms, I don't know off the top of my head if there are any restrictions. I'm happy to follow up with that, but you know, obviously a lot of the platforms out there is a potential to get close by, and some great fishing near some of the the standing platforms. But yeah, I can get more information, and just want to make sure that it's consistent in terms of the wind development, and obviously avoiding any conflicts there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perhaps something we can draw. We can draw on that experience and kind of bring it to the Gulf of Mexico for offshore wind. Great opportunity there. There's a question about when we'll post PowerPoints and where. So likely in the next week or so, once kind of get them collected and then uploaded, and they'll be uploaded to the Governor's Wind Week website webpage, which is where the same one that you use to register for this webinar. So just go to the same place, and we'll either have it directly posted there or linked to it. I see, Laura, you had a question for Dan. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself about decommissioned jackets.
Yeah, Dan, thanks. You know, we talk about the opportunity of using the jackets. I'm just wondering if it's been done anywhere else in the world that you know of.
No, not that I know of, but it makes sense. It makes engineering sense. Everything I've known about the oil and gas platforms and what I've been seeing for the offshore wind, I'm sure we're not the only ones thinking about it, but it has not been practically tried now. But quite honestly, from an engineering standpoint, there's no reason why it's not viable.
Okay, well, we can be the first.
So we should talk.
We should. And I guess, has it not
No,
been?
and I would think that, you know, one of the things I was thinking is when we move forward and they actually have leased space and coordinating with the oil and gas alliance, the idea is that it wouldn't surprise me if some of the site assessment plans are put together, basically doing the site assessment, including the wind measurement at an existing offshore wind platform or offshore oil platform. That would make a lot of sense. So like I said, it doesn't have to be competitive. It can be cooperative to everyone's advantage.
Right. And I was just going to add, you know, unfortunately, I missed the BOEM task force meeting last week. I didn't know if this came up on that task force meeting last week, but I can go back and watch it. Just thought I'd throw that out there in case anybody else participated and knew if BOEM was talking about that at all.
No, I don't recall it really coming up in terms of using an existing platform for, you know, or reusing it for wind. Daniel, do you have something to follow up
So
on?
a quick question Hey, I have a quick question for Lori. So is there an inventory of those oil and gas platforms that will be decommissioned and in what years?
I can find out for you. I don't know. I'm sure we do. I'm sure probably the Bessie side has that information. And we work closely with some of our other trade associations. I know the Offshore Operators Committee is another association that we work closely with, has been working a lot in the wind development space. So let me collaborate with them and we can find out.
Thanks.
That'd be great. And I wonder, if this discussion has been had, with by companies and stakeholders in the North Sea, and if it has, why it wasn't pursued. But we can continue that conversation, and very excited to see where that goes. Don't see any questions. I see a couple comments that I'll read out. David Rogers says existing platforms are not a good fit for new offshore wind turbines, but possibly for substations. So there's another kind of opinion on kind of the potential for reuse. And then an anonymous attendee says that the numbers of birds flying at 0 to 2,000 feet is extremely high. Wind speeds are far faster at higher elevations as well. Will there at least be a small zone, say 1 mile by 1 mile, and a small amount of funds, say a few $1 million, allocated for the demonstration of the simple high elevation wind energy systems? There are units available now that basically consist of 200 or 20 plus parafoil kites that pull a single line that in turn, when wrapped around a drum, spins a generator. In summary, it operates far above birds and wildlife with no need for expensive tower structures, tower foundations, yaw drives, etc. So I don't know if this was also part of your dissertation, Daniel, or have any thoughts on this technology?
No, my dissertation was 40 years ago. So no talk about parafoil kites, but and I don't have an answer to that. That's for Department of Energy, BOEM, National Renewable Energy Lab, for thoughts like that.
Yeah, but no, it's a great question.
So I have to play.
This is something that BOEM has also included in the scope for its RFI. So they're not only looking at interest in offshore wind energy, but also information on other renewable technologies that may be ripe for development in the Gulf of Mexico. So just putting that out there. Let's see. Yes, and just to restate, so BOEM has a request for information, request for interest that is currently out for public comment through July 26th. You can go to the Federal Register to make your official comment. And you can just kind of Google the link and it'll be available, or go to BOEM's website. And I'm sure you can find a link there. But they are actively encouraging folks to get engaged now as early as possible. So this is part of Wind Week, is trying to bolster that engagement and get input or kind of share ideas and kind of hone thoughts as folks are preparing to submit comments. And let's see, I don't see any remaining comments. If I missed yours, if it got buried, just please repost it. And so it's kind of at the top, and I'm going to look at see if somebody has their hand raised. I believe Margie, you have another comment or question?
Yeah, on the gentleman or whomever wrote the thing about kite technology. I've asked this question before on other days. What I am hoping for is that we can be, I know the blade technology is where everyone seems to be focused and heading, but I would love to see the Gulf of Mexico be a place where new technology drops. There are the swaying power type technologies that have no blades, opposed to basic ways and catch wind, and they seem to be very effective, but it is new technology. And the kite technology that was mentioned. And I would love to see at least part of the Gulf set aside for new technology and trying things besides the standard windmill. You know,
No, thank you for your comment. I think that's a great point. So a lot of the interest in kind of blade technology comes from, and offshore wind comes from that last year's National Renewable Energy Laboratory study. They did kind of 2 companion studies looking at several different types of renewable energy in the Gulf, and concluded that offshore wind was had the most technical potential, and was, the technology was most developed at this point and commercially ready. And then they did a follow-up study looking at where in the Gulf was ripe. And so, but that doesn't mean the kind of energy transition and new technologies is certainly underway. And I believe BOEM does have a process for demonstration projects, and the Biden administration and Department of Energy is certainly interested in pursuing and funding research projects. So something to certainly keep top of mind and kind of continue to work on next generation technologies. So thank you for your comment. Any other, we're just a couple minutes left, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I don't see any additional questions. I just want to conclude with a hearty thank you to our panelists. Thank you I thought this was a fantastic, rich discussion. I learned a lot. I hope you did, and I hope our attendees did as well. So thank you. I hope our attendees can tune in tomorrow and Friday as we round out the rest of Wind Week. Tomorrow, we're going to be discussing the transmission line planning and pricing, and so the power purchase component of offshore wind. And so it's going to be a rich discussion. We'll have both regulators, the regulated entities, and big industrial users at the table to kind of think through what that looks like. And then we'll round out the week on Friday with an in-depth look at the supply chain capabilities in Louisiana, both current and future. And so we'll have existing companies that engage in offshore wind in Louisiana for the purposes of and their experience in really being instrumental in the construction of Block Island, the first commercial project in the United States off the coast of Rhode Island. And then we'll invite some of our ports and our economic development organizations to kind of look ahead at what is coming and kind of talk about capabilities and economic trends. So hope you can join us. Once again, thank you all for attending and being a part of Louisiana Wind Week. All right, take care.
Thank you, Harry.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, Harry.
Thank you.